You have spent every single moment of your entire life inside your own mind, and yet science has a deeply unsettling message for you. You are mostly a stranger to yourself. This is not a philosophical provocation. It is one of the most replicated findings in all of experimental psychology. Researchers call it the introspection illusion, and what it reveals is that the explanations you generate for your own choices, emotions, and desires are frequently confabulated stories rather than accurate reports. Your brain is not a transparent window into its own workings. It is more like a spin doctor, a fast-talking narrator who constructs a plausible story after the decision has already been made, then hands you that story and lets you believe you authored it. A landmark series of studies led by psychologist Timothy Wilson at the University of Virginia demonstrated that people consistently generate confident explanations for their preferences and behaviors, yet those explanations bear almost no relationship to the actual causes identified through controlled experiments. Participants who chose one product over another would immediately produce detailed reasons, but when the experimental conditions were secretly altered, the choices changed while the style of confident explanation stayed exactly the same. The words changed, the certainty did not. What is so striking is not that we are occasionally wrong about ourselves, it is that we feel so sure. That unshakable sense of self-insight, the quiet conviction that at least when it comes to your own mind you have privileged access, is itself a cognitive illusion. And once you understand how deep it goes, a lot of puzzling human behavior suddenly starts making sense. So let us look at where the illusion comes from. The word confabulation sounds clinical, but the phenomenon is something you do every single day without realizing it. Confabulation means generating a confident, sincere explanation for something while being completely unaware that the explanation is false. It is not lying. The person who confabulates genuinely believes what they are saying. The brain simply fills gaps with plausible-sounding narrative because leaving a gap feels intolerable. This tendency was first studied dramatically in split-brain patients, people who had undergone surgery severing the corpus callosum, the thick band of fibers connecting the left and right hemispheres. In experiments by neuroscientist Michael Gazzaniga, a command was flashed only to the right hemisphere, which controls the left hand but cannot produce speech. The patient would carry out the action. Then the researcher would ask why. The left hemisphere, the verbal one, had no idea what had just happened, but it never said that. Instead, it instantly generated a confident, coherent story. The mouth kept talking and the story sounded perfectly reasonable because that is what the left hemisphere does. It is an interpreter, a meaning-making machine that cannot tolerate the answer, "I do not know." Here is the unsettling implication. Split-brain patients are an extreme case, but the same interpreter mechanism operates in every one of us. Most of your behavior is driven by processes that never surface to conscious awareness, processes rooted in habit, emotion, unconscious pattern recognition, and past experience. When you are then asked, "Why did you do that?" your conscious mind faces the same problem Gazzaniga's patients faced. It was not in the room when the decision was made, so it does what it always does. It narrates. And it does so with complete confidence because that is the only mode it knows. One of the places the introspection illusion hits hardest is emotion. You might assume that at least when it comes to how you feel, you have direct access. But the research tells a different story. In a now classic study by psychologists Donald Dutton and Arthur Aaron, men crossing a high, swaying suspension bridge were approached by an attractive researcher. Compared to men interviewed on a stable low bridge, the men on the scary bridge were far more likely to call the researcher afterward. The working explanation is that their bodies were already aroused by fear, their hearts already beating fast. And when the researcher appeared, their minds misattributed that arousal to attraction. The label your brain applies to a physical state depends heavily on context, and the label can be spectacularly wrong. This phenomenon, called misattribution of arousal, shows that emotions are not direct readouts of internal states. They are interpretations assembled after the fact using whatever information happens to be available, including information that is completely irrelevant to your actual situation. The same physical sensation of a racing heart can be labeled fear, excitement, or attraction depending on what story your brain decides fits the moment. And once the label is applied, it feels completely self-evident, as if you obviously knew all along how you felt. This is why people often cannot tell the difference between the anxiety of a first date and the excitement of a first date. The body generates a signal, the mind supplies the meaning, and the meaning can be wrong. Understanding this opens a genuinely useful door, because it suggests that if you deliberately reframe the label, for instance, calling pre-performance nerves excitement rather than fear, you can actually shift your emotional experience in measurable ways. The interpretation is not fixed, it just feels that way. If your feelings are often mislabeled, what about your deeper motivations? Why do you really pursue the career you are in, stay in the relationships you have, or make the financial choices you make? Here is where the introspection illusion becomes genuinely uncomfortable. Social psychologist Richard Nisbett, working alongside Timothy Wilson, argued in a highly influential 1977 paper that people rarely have direct access to the actual cognitive processes driving their behavior. Instead, they rely on implicit causal theories, basically cultural common sense about why people do things, and then use those theories to construct an explanation that sounds right. If someone asks why you chose your current job and the culturally accepted reason is passion or purpose, you will search your memory for evidence of passion or purpose, find some, and report that confidently. What you will not do is unearth the unconscious influences. The offhand comment a parent made when you were 9, the status signal attached to the job title, the salary that relieved a specific fear. Those causes are real and measurable by researchers with the right tools, but they are invisible to your introspective gaze. This is not a flaw in a few people. It is the standard operating procedure of the human mind. And it creates a particularly tricky loop because the more you trust your self-reports, the less likely you are to question them. And the less you question them, the more confidently you pass on inaccurate information about yourself to therapists, to partners, and to yourself. This is one reason why even years of ruminating on your own behavior can produce surprisingly little genuine insight, while structured behavioral experiments often produce far more. Thinking harder about yourself is not the same as thinking more accurately about yourself. So if introspection is so unreliable, does that mean self-knowledge is impossible? Not at all. It just means it requires a different strategy than most people use. The first shift is from introspection to observation. Instead of asking yourself why you did something and trusting the first story that surfaces, start treating yourself like a scientist treats a research subject. Track your actual behavior over time. Notice patterns without immediately explaining them. Psychologist Tasha Urish, who has spent years studying self-awareness, found in her research that people with genuine self-awareness ask what far more than why. Why questions invite confabulation? What questions invite observation? Instead of, why am I always anxious at work? Try what specifically happens right before the anxiety spikes. The second shift involves welcoming outside perspectives. Because others observe your behavior from outside the narrative your brain is constantly spinning, they often see patterns you are blind to. This does not mean other people are always right about you, but it does mean their observations carry evidence that your internal monologue tends to filter out. Ask trusted people, not what they think of you in general, but what specific behaviors they consistently notice. The third shift is learning to hold your self-explanations more lightly. When you catch yourself producing a confident reason for a choice or a feeling, treat it as a hypothesis rather than a fact. Ask what else might be going on. The brain hates that question because it disrupts the clean narrative. But that discomfort is usually a signal that something real is being uncovered. The introspection illusion is not a sentence. It is an invitation to get genuinely curious about the stranger you have been living with your whole life. If this changed how you see yourself even slightly, hit like and subscribe because there is so much more of this kind of science waiting for you here.